Hi, and welcome to Chapter 7. This is on reproduction and embryonic development. If you didn't figure this out, I put a bird and a bee here, so I'm going to be talking about the birds and the bees. In other words, I'm going to be talking about how babies are made. So let's get started. First of all, when a man loves a woman, no, I'm just kidding. Let's jump right into it. First of all, we need to talk about the difference between asexual and sexual reproduction. Asexual has some nice advantages. You don't have to produce all the sperm. You don't have to produce the egg. We don't have to go into that whole deal of reproductive cycle. But there's disadvantages as well. In other words, the whole purpose of sex is to get variation in offspring. And so right here we have an anemone that was one anemone and now it's split into two. And so we call that asexual reproduction. Have we produced two new organisms? For sure, but they're genetically similar. And so what does sex offer us? Sex offers us variability. And so a few terms that we need to get to know. Gametes are going to be produced in sexual reproduction. Those are sperm and egg. When the sperm fertilizes the egg, we call that then a zygote. So let me show you a few pictures. This would be an anemone that's actually showing both forms of reproduction. This would be asexual or cloning, and this would be formation of eggs, and so that's going to be sexual reproduction. These worms, or earthworms in general, are hermaphrodites. What that means is that they have both female and male sexual parts. The advantage of that is that if you're wandering through the dirt, you don't have to worry about finding that correct sex of the other type. They can just swap sperm, they can kind of crawl away, and then eventually make a number of worms. If you always wondered what that little section on an earthworm was, it's called the clitellum, and that's actually will move off a worm, and it'll form this kind of cocoon where the baby worms will hatch. As far as reproduction goes, or fertilization, we can have internal and external fertilization. This is the female frog right here, and she's releasing all of her eggs, which are fertilized by the male. And so you can produce a whole bunch of offspring really, really quickly, but we don't have to give them a lot of parental care. Now, that's not how the way we reproduce. We reproduce using internal fertilization, and so the advantage of that is that you can make sure that you're giving a lot of parental care to those offspring. And so this is a picture of a human egg being fertilized by a number of different sperm. First, let's go over the female anatomy a little bit. As far as the major part, we've got an ovary out here. Ovary is going to be where the eggs are produced. Females actually are born with all the eggs they'll ever have. Inside there, if you look on the surface of the ovary, there'll be these little bumps, and what those are follicles. Follicles are going to be a group of cells that actually surround that egg. Now, when we leave that egg, or that egg is actually leaving the ovary, we call that ovulation. And so here's an egg cell that's leaving the ovary. That egg cell is going to float down the oviduct, where it'll eventually be fertilized by a sperm, hopefully, and then it'll implant into the endometrium, which is the lining of the uterus. And so this is where the baby will sit. Outside that, we have the vagina, which is just going to be a receptacle for the sperm to arrive. And then we have a cervix, which is generally plugged up. But that's going to be the differentiation between the vagina and the uterus. When a baby is born, it has to make its way through that cervix. I think I hit everything on female anatomy. If we go to male anatomy, the sperm are going to be created in the testes, which are right down here. We're constantly making sperm our whole life as far as males go. The sperm will start to mature inside this, which is a bunch of tubules called the epididymis. And then eventually, when we ejaculate, all of those sperm are going to move all the way down this. This is the vas deferens. It's really, really long, and that has to do with us being upright. It used to be much shorter, but as humans started to walk upright, that tube's gotten really long. They're then going to go by a series of glands. This would be the seminal vesicle, and this is the prostate gland. They're giving nutrients for that the sperm, and so that they can eat, essentially, on their way. We also have a bulbourethral gland, and that's going to secrete an alkaline material out of the penis before the sperm come out, and that kind of neutralizes the acidic environment of the vagina. When we ejaculate, then what is that? Well, it's a combination of all of these things. So it's sperm, but it's also like fructose sugar that's going to come out of the seminal vesicles, and all of the combination of those secretions of the glands and the sperm are going to be what we call as semen. How does the erection work? There's a spongy material inside the penis, and as that starts to enlarge with blood, it'll actually pinch off the vein, and so blood can't get its way out. So it's a cool kind of a positive feedback loop. The way we make sperm and the way we make eggs are quite a bit different. Sperm are made our whole life. And again, the process is meiosis. So we're taking those cells, this would be inside the testes, we're producing new sperm, which will actually develop as they move towards the inside of that seminiferous tubule, which is going to be these long tubules inside the testes. We make it our whole life, and each of those becomes a viable sperm. On the eggs, you're actually born with about 400,000, and then we start to lose those our whole life. And we're going to lose one a month, but an interesting part of that is that that cytoplasm of the egg has to stay within that egg. In other words, a zygote is mostly made up of what is produced in the female's egg. And so they have a unique way. Instead of producing 4 viable eggs, they're actually just going to produce 1. And so what happens to all that genetic information that's made in meiosis? That forms something called a polar body. Now it'll stop at this point. So we have what's called delayed meiosis. And so until that sperm actually fertilizes the egg, we don't finish meiosis. Then we lose the polar bodies, and then we finally have a zygote. So how does this all regulated? It's all regulated by chemicals. And so we've got 2 types of hormones. Those are called luteinizing and follicular stimulating hormone. Those come from the pituitary, but what they're going to do is send a message to the ovaries, and then the ovaries are going to send a message to the egg. And so we have an increase in luteinizing and follicular stimulating hormone, and you can see that that corresponds directly with the creation and the maturation of the follicle, and then eventually ovulation, or the leaving of that egg. Now, what's left of the follicle actually stays within the ovary, and it becomes something called the corpus luteum, and the corpus luteum gives off other chemicals. So it's going to start giving off estrogen, but then we give off progesterone. Those chemicals in concert will maintain the endometrium, and so the endometrium, again, is that lining of the uterus. And so what we see is a buildup of the endometrium, and it's timed perfectly so that when that egg is actually fertilized, it's able to implant in the endometrium. If it doesn't, then we'll menstruate. In other words, we'll lose all of that endometrium, and so that level is going to decrease. I hope that makes sense. I've lost my timer for a second. Okay, so next little section, I've only got a few minutes, is about development. So what happens after that egg is fertilized? Well, it becomes a zygote, and that zygote splits in half and splits in half and splits in half, and now we have what are called stem cells. But those will eventually form a blastula, which is a ball of cells. It'll then fold in on itself and form something called a gastrula. A gastrula has 3 levels. It's got the ectoderm, it's got the endoderm, and then it has the mesoderm. Ectoderm will form things like our nervous tissue. Skin is going to come from ectoderm. The endoderm is going to form the lining of like our digestive tract and our lungs. And then the mesoderm is going to make up our muscles and our bones. And so each of these are destined for a different part of our body. How do those cells know which part they're going to be? It's their location within that gastrula. This is how it looks like in a frog. So you can see again those 3 levels, from the endoderm to the mesoderm and then finally to the ectoderm. And you can kind of see this neural fold, which will eventually fold over and form that neural tube. Now, that's not what it looks like in humans at all, and in fact, it's hard to tell what it looks like in humans because the whole thing is hidden within the endometrium. But what we have is trophoblast, which is going to surround that embryo, and so as we start to advance through this, again, you can see that now we've got those layers again. So we've got the ectoderm, we've got the endoderm, and then we've got the mesoderm, and they're going to form those same layers. An interesting point that we have is that we have the formation of a placenta, and that placenta is going to be kind of a bridge between the blood of the mother and the blood of the child. Remember, that child has half of its genetic information from the father, and so if the blood were to mix, our body would actually reject it. So eventually the baby gets bigger and the bigger, and then eventually it's born. And so that's going to be a positive feedback loop where the head of the baby pushes on the cervix, which actually causes more contractions. And if everything works out, then you eventually have a family, and this would be my family.